please welcome George Newhouse.
Thank you very much for those kind words. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of this land. To them, we are all boat people. Let me get technology working. Right. I need to give you a warning. This presentation does contain some disturbing images, self-harm, beatings, some massacres and images of the deceased, and I can understand those of you that might want to avoid them. They're not, hopefully not too graphic, but I have had some people who've been surprised by them, so I want to warn you that these are images that you might see this evening. I'm honoured to be invited here tonight, and for the kind words of the Governor, and also I'm most appreciative of the hard work of ARA staff. And I hope that I can give you a little bit of insight into Australia's asylum seeker policy. Now, I'm sorry to say that I didn't know that much about the way our government treated asylum seekers until the cases of Cornelia Rao and Vivian Salon. Frankly, when I did dig deeper into those cases and the truth came out, I was horrified about the stories of their brutal treatment and the cowboy culture that existed inside the Department of Immigration. I felt so angry about the way those women had been treated that I resolved to do something about the system. And Vivian and Cornelia led me into a parallel universe of cruelty and unsanctioned punishment created by our politicians, which is the subject of my oration today. But before we get to Manus Island, I'd like to start by considering what our Prime Minister thinks about the morality of his government's harsh deterrence policy.
A web question that's come in is from Brenton Anthony in Canberra. When it comes to asylum seekers, what would Jesus do?
Well, now I'm not a Christian, but I'm pretty certain that Jesus wouldn't be treating anyone as cruelly as we are treating men and women men and children on Manus. Even if Jesus was concerned about asylum seekers coming to Australia by boat, I doubt he would ever justify a policy of intentionally harming vulnerable people to deter them. Now, some of you will know that I work with this man. He's known to most of you as Major Mori. Dan Mori acted for David Hicks when David was incarcerated in Guantanamo Bay. Dan and I are part of Shine Lawyer's social justice team, and Dan has now moved to Australia. He lives in Melbourne, and we're very fortunate to assist some of Australia's most vulnerable people. And Dan and I often present seminars at legal conferences, and I tend to deal with rather dry and boring topics like, the government's duty of care to refugees. And Dan gets to do presentations on targeted or extrajudicial killings, which are much more popular, I must tell you. But what I find really interesting about Dan's presentations is how our moral compass has changed in a generation or so. When I was a lad, a licence to kill without the sanction of the courts was something that governments and their secret services undertook quietly and out of sight of the community. It was something slightly shameful. In those days, James Bond held a licence to kill number 7, and even the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad, with the help of Eric Bana, worked quietly and in secret to assassinate the perpetrators of the 1972 Munich Olympics massacre. But if we jump forward almost 40 years after the Munich massacre, we see the mainstreaming of extrajudicial killings. On the 2nd of May 2011, the US President personally supervised the operation that ended in the death of Osama bin Laden. Now, Osama bin Laden had not been tried by a court before he was shot, but even President Obama had no qualms about authorising an operation to get him dead or alive. But tonight's oration is not about President Obama the Mossad, 00, or even 007. It's about Australia's shocking treatment of asylum seekers. Now, I'm sure I don't have to remind the audience that in the lead up to the Holocaust and during World War II, Jews fleeing Nazi persecution were routinely handed back to Germany by neighbouring countries and by the international community. It was the international outcry which followed the Holocaust, which led to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 and the UN Refugee Convention in 1951. The Australian government's legal obligations under the Refugee Convention are embodied in the Immigration Act. They're supposed to protect asylum seekers and stop them from being returned to harm or death. Our international obligations do not condone the intentional infliction of harm on asylum seekers simply because they arrive in Australia in a boat. Now, earlier I compared President Obama's sanctioned killing of Osama bin Laden to the secret actions of Mossad following the Munich massacre and the public's newfound acceptance of state-sanctioned murder. But the intervening years have also seen a marked shift in Australia's attitudes to boat arrivals. They kind of look the same. In 1976, the boat arrivals look the same as 2013, but attitudes have changed. Between 1976 and 1982, a bipartisan refugee policy saw the Australian government admit thousands of Vietnamese boat people to Australia. None were detained in a camp. None of them was issued with a temporary protection visa. None of them died directly as a result of a vindictive border security policy. But in recent years, Australia has developed a border protection policy based on the deliberate, systematic, wanton infliction of physical and mental suffering. Our government knows that detention centres are factories for mental illness. Patrick McGorry told them that in 2010, and as recently as a couple of weeks ago, studies are confirming the parlous state of mental health in detention centres. But when you look at the PNG solution, that is a cynical strategy designed to shift responsibility for asylum seekers to a harsh, threatening environment in another country, away from judicial oversight, away from forensic investigations by police and coroners, to a lawless place without any accountability. And both major political parties have shown that they're prepared to harm vulnerable people in their quest to win elections. Their political polling confirms that their re-election prospects justify the means. Just this week, the Minister for Immigration and the Prime Minister were out crowing in Parliament about stopping the boats. And the price for that is human lives. But the Prime Minister and the Minister for Immigration haven't had to have the misfortune that I've had to sit through coronial inquests into the deaths of asylum seekers at sea or in immigration detention centres. Try and imagine how sickening it is to hear stories of how 15 children died in a shipwreck off Christmas Island. All of them were under the age of 9 years. Not a single child under the age of 9 years survived that shipwreck. And then you hear stories of 9-year-old orphans who had to watch their parents drown before their eyes. And then you had to listen to descriptions and even watch videos. I've seen Serco videos of people jumping off balconies at Villawood immigration detention centres in pointless suicides and deaths in custody. The numerous deaths in detention and at sea send a clear message that lives are expendable in the implementation of political objectives and that the cruelty of the system is intentional. Now, you're probably aware of the Commonwealth Government's messages to refugees, but I hope you will allow me to restate the dog whistle messages that our government broadcasts to the world. So I'm going to show you some slides with some messages that I think that the government is sending. The first one is, if you come in a boat, you might die because the Indonesians aren't very good at saving you, and asylum seeker boat rescues get treated less favourably than other rescues at sea. And that is a fact that came out in coronial inquests into boat disasters. Asylum seeker vessels that call for Mayday are treated differently from any other vessel on the high seas. And if you think that I'm being too cynical about the government's messages, I want to show you some images from the government's own international campaign, which I think they released last year or early this year, to deter asylum seekers. So don't accept my word for this. Let's look at what message the government wants to send asylum seekers. This cartoon was distributed, I think, in the Middle East, Afghanistan, and in Iraq and possibly Iran, and possibly also in Sri Lanka. So that's not my image, that's what the government's distributing. Message 2, if you come in a boat, we'll send you to Devil's Island on Manus or Nauru. And this is the government's own campaign. Looks very unpleasant. If you, once again, if you come in a boat, you or your children could be hurt. And I don't have a cartoon for that, but the message is reinforced by the minister's own comments. When he commented on the death of Reza Barati, he explained that this was not a situation that was not anticipated, which is, there's a couple of negatives there, but he kind of anticipated that this was going to happen. It was a situation, but he blamed the victims. It's a situation where people put themselves at risk. And it'd be in the detainees' best interests if they conducted themselves appropriately. The other messages are that we will criminalise, demonise and dehumanise you. So the minister wants boat people to be called illegals, even if they aren't. And they recently, in October last year, had a crime crackdown. Don't know why. Why? But maybe it was just to criminalise, demonise and dehumanise them. This is imagery that does support that dog whistle message, and I think this one does too. And once again, they are government images, not mine. Finally, or not finally, we will threaten independent observers and health officials if they intervene to protect you. So Amnesty International copped a broadside and a warning from Scott Morrison to be careful about what they say after visiting asylum seeker detention camps. Why? And the refugee health group that was established as a direct result of Cornelia Rao's experience in Baxter Detention Centre was gutted, and that was a direct recommendation of the Palmer Inquiry. But because that body was telling the minister that he was intentionally harming people's mental health, he sacked them. And finally, this is the final message. If you come in a boat, we will never give you a visa to come to Australia. You could be resettled offshore and you will live in limbo and uncertainty. Now, to make matters worse, there are a group of... I don't want to forget these people because I act for about two of them, but there are 50 in this country. There is a group of around 50 asylum seekers with negative security assessments by ASIO who are living in a Kafkaesque world of indefinite detention. Without the right to know any of the allegations against them, these miserable individuals have been assessed by the government as asylum seekers, but they're still being jailed indefinitely without being brought before a court or any other oversight and with no right of appeal. Some have been in prison without a trial for over 5 years with no prospects of ever being released, hence their request to be killed as quickly as possible because they have no alternative. The government won't send them anywhere else. There's nowhere for them to go. They won't release them. They don't know the reasons why they're being held. And they have no prospect of being released. And last year, the UN's Human Rights Committee found that Australia had breached the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights by indefinitely detaining refugees who have failed security assessments. The UN Human Rights Committee said that Australia had violated Articles 7 and 9 of the Convention by detaining refugees arbitrarily, failing to provide them with an effective judicial remedy, and subjecting them to conditions of detention which are cumulatively inflicting serious psychological harm on them. And I know that is true. Australia has been criticised internationally because what we're doing to these people is cruel and it is intentionally harming them, and our Constitution, sadly, does not protect them. And for a Bill of Rights. But after the debate under the last government, and that failed debate, I don't hold my breath waiting for that to happen. So, what's the link then between the subject matter of my debate, the massacre in Lebanon in 1983 and the Manus Island riots? But, by now many Australians are aware at some level of what's happening on Manus Island. But tonight I want to compare not so much what happened in those refugee camps, both in Lebanon and Manus, although I will go into the history of them for you. I want to compare the response of the Israeli government to the deaths in Sabra and Shatila under its watch, to the secretive and manipulative approach of the Australian government to investigating the death and the maiming and injury of individuals on Manus. I'd like to explore how little scrutiny there is of our government's inhumane policies and ask why the search for truth and justice in respect of basic rights and freedoms has been eroded in the years since Sabra and Shatila. In 1983, 300,000 Israelis took to the streets to force their Defence Minister Ariel Sharon to resign following the publication of the findings of an inquiry into the Sabra and Shatila massacres. In 2014, there's been a muted response to the release of the Cornell report into the Manus Island riots. But to understand the reasons for the different responses, it's worth comparing the incidents and how the government's responded. So, the Manus Island riots were predictable. Several international human rights bodies visited Manus Island, including Amnesty International, who were criticised by the minister and subsequently proved to be right. Maybe if he'd listened to the Amnesty International instead of shutting them up, might not have had the deaths, because these were the sorts of issues that Amnesty were actually raising. So the Manus Island riots were predictable. International human rights bodies visited Manus Island and expressed concerns about the living conditions, the treatment of asylum seekers living there, including rape dungeons, the presence of unaccompanied minors in an adult facility, and inhumane conditions. And despite G4S, the security guards, management warning the Commonwealth Government against doing so, on the 16th of February, the Department of Immigration announced that asylum seekers staying at Manus Island would never be resettled in Australia, only in PNG. That announcement led to an attempted breakout, which was stopped with brutal force. A G4S guard reported that the force used to do that, to stop the breakout, was way above what was required. And when the detainees were returned to the centre, they were beaten again by the local guards, and some of them sustained broken bones and head injuries. The next day, tension in the camp was high following the announcement and the bashings. Local G4S guards were making threatening gestures from the outside of the compound, and a G4S guard reported that PNG nationals were collecting makeshift weapons outside the compound. It appears obvious that something bad was going to happen. Now, there were some peaceful protests that occurred later in the evening on the 17th, and those protests seem to have turned sour later in the evening. At some point during the protest, the internal gate between two compounds collapsed, and the incident response team, made up of local and foreign guards who were on standby in full riot kit, were deployed to secure it. There was a power blackout. As things got out of hand, expat workers were evacuated and security was handed over to the PNG police. As they abandoned the camp, the Australian workers had a fair idea of what was going to happen to the vulnerable men and unaccompanied children that were left behind. The following conversation was said to have taken place. Guard says, "We need to withdraw. Do you want us to hand over to the PNG police?" The response from the radio is, "Yes, hand it over to them." Guard says, "Are you sure? Do you know the consequences of that?" The response is, "Yes, hand it over." And it appears then that PNG police and locals with weapons such as machetes then entered the centre from the road, followed by uniformed PNG nationals, some of them firing shots. As they entered the compound, they started assaulting asylum seekers. PNG nationals dragged asylum seekers out of their rooms in order to beat them before looting the rooms. Reports from witnesses at the scene describe seeing blood everywhere and hearing the cries of the injured. A 23-year-old asylum seeker who you see there, Reza Barati, was taken to the medical triage centre with a shattered skull. However, the medics were unable to help him due to his extensive injuries and he died. Reports have now emerged that Reza was viciously beaten by a PNG national, allegedly employed by the Salvation Army, who actually had responsibility for caring for asylum seekers. To add to this tragedy, other asylum seekers report that when Reza heard gunfire, he fled to his room to keep safe, but instead he died in the most appalling circumstances. Now, Reza is not much older than my son, and I can't imagine the fear that that young boy must have felt in his final moments. Now, as I reported earlier, blood sprays and bloody handprints were found all over walls and floors throughout the centre, which is consistent with asylum seekers being dragged out of their rooms and beaten. One man lost his eye. Now, I don't deny, this is Sabra and Shatila, that the circumstances of Sabra and Shatila were much worse than Manus Island. On the 15th of September 1982, the Israeli Defence Forces moved into Beirut. The next day, and with the knowledge of Israeli military officers, Lebanese Christian militia were given access to the camps where they slaughtered over 800 civilians. The massacre was presented as retaliation for the assassination of newly elected Christian Lebanese President Bashar Gemayel. And the United Nations declared that a war crime. But what I want to focus on is the Israeli response. It was swift. On the 28th of September 1982, the Israeli government appointed the president of its Supreme Court, not a political appointee of the Howard government, but the president of its Supreme Court, Yitzhak Kahan, to investigate the massacre. Kahan found that the Defence Minister, Ariel Sharon, bore personal responsibility for the massacre, for ignoring the danger of bloodshed and revenge, and not taking appropriate measures to prevent bloodshed. Sharon's negligence in protecting the civilian population of Beirut when under Israeli control, Judge Kahan said, was a breach of a duty which the Defence Minister was charged, and it was recommended that Sharon be dismissed. And he did eventually stand down. The Kahan report also condemned Israeli General Rafael Eitan for breach of duty in not taking steps to stop the massacre. It said he should have anticipated the danger and opposed the decision to send the militia into the camp. And the judicial report went further. It condemned the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, and his government's role and dismissed their feeble argument that Israel could not be held directly accountable. And then 300,000 people took to the streets of Tel Aviv to demand that Mr. Sharon resign. And Israel's standard in the international community which had sunk to an all-time low in the wake of the massacre, rebounded following the publication of that report. And Israel was praised in many quarters for having investigated itself and punished senior members of its government. Now, in contrast to the Israeli response to Sabra and Shatila, our government issued a deceptive media statement on the 18th of February, reporting that there'd been an incident which didn't involve the PNG police, which blamed the detainees, suggesting that the riots were caused by them breaching perimeter fences, and he denied that the police entered the camp. It took days for the minister to correct the record. And instead of a judicial inquiry, which is the equivalent of a royal commission, the minister appointed John Howard's former secretary of the Attorney General's Department, Robert Cornell, to undertake an internal review of the events of 17th of February with carefully manicured and limited terms of reference. The terms didn't include a determination of the cause of the riots or any responsibility for them. And Mr. Cornell's review fails to isolate a single event that triggered the riot or apportion any blame to it. Now, there is a Legal and Constitutional Affairs References Committee inquiry set up by the Senate, which has been established the incident, and it has not yet reported, and I'm hoping that they might make some more meaningful findings. We'll see. But it's not that our government has forgotten how to undertake inquiries, but our cynical media-managed political environment, but in our cynical media-managed political environment, they're only used now, well, mostly used now, for attacking your political enemies, such as through the Pink Bats inquiry or the inquiry into trade union governance and corruption. But when it comes to immigration, there's no accountability or a desire for reform. Now, how do our governments get away with this? Freud says that one of the primary functions of society is to restrain our aggressive impulses. It achieves this goal by installing in the individual a sort of watchdog which Freud calls the superego, a form of guilt to master our desire for aggression. And in the 30 years since the Kahan inquiry, why is our sense of guilt towards the violent treatment of innocent men, women and children diminished? How is it that the compassion that the international community and Australians once felt for victims of torture and trauma and those at risk of death and harm been dissipated? How have we become so desensitised? Why are our politicians and our public servants who oversaw the mayhem on Manus Island not being held accountable? The government spent $25 million on establishing the Royal Commission into the Pink Bats inquiry to investigate the deaths of 4 young men, but will not hold a coronial inquest or a Royal Commission into the death of Reza Barati and over 50 other people who were injured in the riots. Now, I know that the young men who died in installing Pink Bats were all one of us. They were someone's son, they were our neighbours, our brothers, but so was Reza. He was someone's son, he was someone's brother and someone's neighbour, but he died in unspeakable fear when he was under the protection of the Australian government. And can you imagine what the Australian government would do if an Australian citizen had his head crushed by a contractor in Papua New Guinea? There'd be an outcry for a proper investigation, or an inquest at least. And can you imagine the headlines in the Murdoch press if a New Guinea national did this to one of us? Do you think Margaret Thatcher was right when she claimed there is no such thing as society anymore? Is it possible that the response to the Holocaust was a blip in our history, and that the pendulum in favour of protecting human rights is returning back to its equilibrium? By way of example, after World War II, former Labor leader Doc Evatt led the international push to proclaim the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Australia was at the forefront of international human rights. But over 60 years later, the New South Wales branch of the Labor Party can't even bring themselves to support a watered-down, minimalist Australian Bill of Rights. That pathetic Bill of Rights campaign could not even garner the support of the largest branch of the Labor Party in the country. What a shameful state of affairs. Are we just returning to our natural immigration policy setting, which is best described as the white Australian policy? In addition, and to make matters worse, our government and the media are actively conditioning us to treat asylum seekers as subhuman. And that was the strategy so effectively implemented by the Nazis that allowed the Nazis to murder millions of gays, gypsies, Jews, disabled people with the complicity of a nation, with the complicity of its military and governmental administrators. Now, Yitzhak Kahan was not prepared to let the Israeli government and its military off the hook in 1983 because he'd actually seen the Nazis' policies firsthand. He escaped the Nazis, and he'd seen how the Nazi officials later denied personal responsibility after the war. I'm not so sure that many young Australians would be aware of the Nazi techniques for dehumanising minority groups. They would not recall the parade of Nazis from the top brass down, proclaiming that they were innocent because they were just following orders in the course of their war crimes trial. We've returned to a cynical age of plausible deniability where nobody takes responsibility. Our politicians have rigged the system, so any trouble on Manus Island is not the minister's responsibility. It's the fault of the contractors, like G4S or the Salvation Army, or even better, it's the fault of PNG locals. And there's a nice little dog whistle message there too. It's anyone else's fault except the minister and except the Australian government. And for those of you who are old enough to remember, whatever happened to the concept of ministerial responsibility for the failures of your department and your own decisions? That quaint concept ended many years ago. Now, we literally let the minister and this government get away with murder. So, when will things change? In 2006, the public exposure of the circumstances of Cornelia Rao's detention and Vivian Solon's deportation were game changers in the system of migration detention in Australia. I know that Australians were horrified by these events. We didn't get protests in the street, but I'm pretty sure that even Amanda Vanstone and John Howard were shocked when they discovered what happened to those two women. Because Vivian was an Australian citizen and Cornelia was a permanent resident with a mental illness, their tragic circumstances enabled Australians to understand and relate to the horrors of our immigration system. But what people don't know is that many of the important reforms implemented following the Palmer inquiry into those cases have been reversed by the Abbott government. Now, sadly, neither major party is able to shift its harsh asylum policies because there seems to be a race to the bottom in policy terms, and the Labor Party is unable to counter the Liberal Party criticism that they're soft on asylum seekers. So the reality is that things won't change until we get a Liberal Party leader that has the strength of character to do the right thing. And I hope that day comes soon, Malcolm Turnbull. But in the meantime, it's incumbent on all of us to spread the word about the cruelty being perpetrated in our name and to press this government, on all governments, for policy reform and to demand the humane treatment of detainees. Now, in wrapping up, I do want to congratulate the ARA for their work with refugees. It's very important work. And also for stimulating this debate tonight. I know that they may not agree with everything I've said tonight, but the work that they do is absolutely vital. And I want to thank them for inviting me tonight, for their hard work in putting on this oration, and thank you for listening and taking time to be here tonight. And I am happy to answer some questions. Thank you very much.